Good. Okay, thanks a lot for the introduction. The benefit of doing multiple lectures is that we can skip the first part and go straight to the content. Yeah. Sustainability, transitions, and incumbents. Trying to look a bit at what happens inside these big, well-established actors and how that might matter for transitions. Here, good. So why incumbents? So if we go a few years back, then our, at that time, chairman, Frank Giels of the network, wrote these sentences in one of the newsletters, right? So basically he was saying, we've done many studies of green innovations, and now we could pay more attention to the decline of existing non-sustainable systems, practices, and technologies. This topic would also mean addressing resistance and possible reorientation of big incumbent actors. And this followed from this emphasis on niches, right, in the literature on sustainability transition. So many studies have actually tried to understand and analyze in detail niche formation processes, but the role of these large, big firms and how they might slow down transition processes had been significantly less studied. So now, 6 years later, one of the readings I put on the list was this recent paper, short paper, Viewpoint by Bruno Turnheim and Benjamin Sovacool, where they talk about incumbents. And they sort of conclude that the role of incumbencies in transitions is a vibrant and promising avenue for research, right? So something has happened in those 6 years. It's been building a quite growing, as I'll get back to, a growing literature around incumbents, but it's still considered a promising avenue for research. There's still lots of different aspects that we need to study more in order to understand the role that they play in transition processes. So in that sense, it might be a sort of, I don't know if not ideal, but at least a very sort of interesting topic worth further developing, because there's something to base research on, but also a lot of opportunities for digging deep. But what is actually an incumbent, right? So it's a word being used by many, but perhaps also being used in slightly different ways, right? So the Oxford English Dictionary talk about it being an attributive of a company, having a sizable share of a market, for instance, a powerful incumbent airlines. So incumbents possess power, resources, and a large market share because of a presence they have in industries over a long time span. So importantly, these characteristics relate to and result from existing markets and technologies. And this is crucial, as we'll get back to a bit later. So we have incumbents in every industry, yeah? But the importance of incumbents varies across sectors, depending on the barriers to entry. So in order to sort of understand this point here, we might go back to one of the classic papers, Keith Parvitt and his taxonomy of different types of industries, the seminal paper from the 1980s, where he categorizes industries into different types. He talks about supplier-dominated industries, production-intensive industries, which can either be scale-intensive or specialized suppliers, and then science-based industries. When we talk about the role played by incumbents in different industries, then we expect those to be particularly large in scale-intensive industries. So why do we expect them to be particularly important here? Well, firstly, these are very capital-intensive industries. So it's simply difficult to get a foot in the door if you want. And this means that large firms are also more likely to innovate because, for instance, the large established players are also the ones that have access to testing out potential new innovations in existing facilities. Think about a steel factory or a pulp and paper plant. Today, I'll focus on the role of incumbents in this specific type of industry in the remaining part of the lecture today. And there's a reason for that. Now, if we take sort of a very macro perspective on where energy is coming from and where it's being used in our world as it is today, we'll see that industry makes up a very significant share of end use, even bigger than transport. even if sort of, I think, transitions literature, probably transport has been researched a lot more than industry. But actually, if you look at end use, then industry is more prominent than transport. If we disaggregate industry, so we look at different types of industries, we'll see that there are a few industries that really constitute the majority of energy use. Iron and steel, chemicals and petrochemicals, pulp and paper, and cement. Okay, so all scale-intensive industries. Also, if we look at what is actually needed in order to reach a 2-degree scenario by 2050, so basically meaning what is needed if we are to be able to live on this planet in the medium long-term future, right? We can see that industry needs to make very significant reductions in emissions. Again, even bigger than transportation. What does this mean? This basically means that industry is extremely important for targeting climate change. Within industry, it's a very select group of industries or sectors that make up the majority of emissions. Those industries are all scale intensive. And obviously within those scale intensive industries, they're actually made up of a relatively small number of very big actors who very much sort of steer this industry. And that is, of course, on the one hand, promising, because it means that if we can sort of make sure that these few big incumbents in these industries actually become engaged in a constructive sense with a transition process, then it might also, it might quickly solve one of the big problems we have. But of course, the issue, as we'll get back to later today, is that maybe it's particularly difficult to get these incumbents sort of turned around. So the outline of the lecture today is to talk about how incumbents have been researched in sustainability transitions literature. And then I'm going to spend a bit of time on the ability of incumbents to innovate, drawing on our organizational studies literature. And finally, give an empirical illustration from the pulp and paper industry in Sweden and Finland. I don't think I'll have time to talk about the role of policy, but if I anyway do, then I'll say a few words about that in the end. Otherwise, we'll have to leave that for discussion. So if we look at the transitions literature, as I mentioned, I think that it's fair to say there's been a general emphasis on the development of niches. So for instance, the TIS approach that we talked about yesterday is primarily used to analyze new emerging technologies, even if it can be analyzing all types of technologies. This is how it has mostly been used. However, arguably, it's equally important to focus on regimes and incumbents, because incumbents play very important roles for the functioning of regimes, and thereby also the extent to which they will actively resist emerging sustainable technologies, or rather choose to restructure their activities. So I did a quick Web of Science search from 2010 until today to look at how many papers are actually focusing on incumbents. And it produces 153 hits. Many of them are sort of only marginally relevant for sustainability transitions, but we do see that there is sort of an upward trend here in papers on this topic. So it is really becoming a topic that is gaining increasing interest. One attempt to integrate incumbents more firmly in the sustainability transitions theory is the triple embeddedness framework by Giels. So I see this as sort of a way of trying to deal with some of the key criticisms that have been raised against the MLP framework, in particular the lack of agency and the way that regimes are operationalized. So what is the point of this framework? Well, the point is that actions by incumbent firms are embedded in 3 different contexts: the economic environment, customers and suppliers; socio-political environment, policymakers, civil society, etc. And then the industry regime or the industry context, formal and informal institutions. Now the point is that these 3 contexts influence the actions of incumbent firms. However, in my opinion, then perhaps the biggest step forward in this paper is that Giels sort of slightly opens up the strategy box of the firm. Yeah. So Giles talks about how when there's no pressure on incumbents, then they simply reproduce their own routines and the regime becomes institutional. Then as pressure starts to sort of slowly emerge, incumbents engage in sort of a dismissal of this pressure, which still leads to routine reproduction and reinforcing the regime. As pressure sort of builds up gradually, incumbents might engage in local search, sort of small adjustments in routines and procedures. As pressure grows further, we can talk about more distant search, beginning to see strategic reorientation of the incumbents. And then finally, when we have major external stress, continuing structural performance problems, then we see what Giles talks about as strategic recreation, where we really see that the core beliefs, the missions, the identity become modified. So while I think that it's worth applauding that Giles actually includes firm strategy in this model, I also think that it's done in a quite simple way. Yeah. So in fact, it is a linear model of strategy change, if you want, right? So you have increasing pressure, and then you go to stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, etc., where you see that they engage in increasing reorientation as a result of this pressure. Right? I think as a general principle, if you're outside of physics and you classical economics, then linear models, they are perhaps of limited use for our understanding of a given topic. So I would argue that we need a much more sophisticated understanding of the factors that hinder the repositioning of incumbents and how these factors may be overcome. But luckily there's hope. So this is probably too small for you to read, but it is hope. It is luckily also one of the papers that is on the reading list. So I hope you've had a look at it before. This is the recent review published by Van Mossel and colleagues, which very nicely reviews different theories within the management literature that offer insights into incumbent behavior in transition processes. So essentially, the triple embeddedness model is quite closely aligned with institutional theory. But there are other approaches to study the role of incumbents in transitions. And most importantly, there are also other approaches that places much greater emphasis on the opportunities for firms to act independently, rather than firm behavior simply being determined by the environment embedding the firm. Now, if I sort of scan the literature that I see is available today in sustainability transitions research on incumbents, I would say that there's sort of two topics that stand out. First one is the motivation of incumbents in transition processes, and the second one is the ability of incumbents to innovate and drive transitions. So there's been work by Giles which introduces politics and power into the multi-level perspective, but also other authors have considered the topic. In particularly, the work by David Hess is very relevant to read here. So Hess talks about how incumbents might use a strategy of marginalization and blockage, where they basically mobilize the different types of resources to block attempts to change regulations, which might lead to the, or which might cause difficulties for them to carry out their business as they've otherwise done. Second strategy that Hess talks about is incorporation and transformation. So he talks about incorporating aspects of niches into incumbent production systems, potentially transforming the niche in the process. One example that he gives here is that of organic food, which went from being a challenge towards the existing food production system to become a variant within the industrial food production system. So in that sense, the niche was incorporated, if you want, into the actions of the existing food production system. So unlike the paper by Giles, Hess is not only focusing on the resistance of incumbents towards transition processes, but he is also highlighting how strategic reorientation may happen in incumbents. A second paper that takes a similar perspective is this one here by some of our colleagues from Utrecht, Magda Smink and colleagues, where they studied two different industries in the Dutch context: LED lighting and biofuels. So in the case of LED lighting, they show that the incumbents here continuously stated in media and in government meetings that LED is not a market-ready technology. And they also insisted on existing standards and blocking development of new standards, thereby preventing further legitimization of LED. Very similarly, in the case of biofuels, incumbents were constantly highlighting the disadvantages of biofuels in media and in public consultations. And they were at the same time also pushing for second generation biofuels, knowing that the time horizon for that technology was further down the line than first generation technology. So essentially buying more time to be able to sort of sell the products, sell the fossil fuels, if you want. And also promoting unnecessary strong criteria and standardization. Now, both of these cases very nicely show both the marginalization in terms of sort of media and public consultations, and the blockage in terms of actions around standardization strategies, which Hess outlined in his paper as well. And additionally, the cases also show, again, as highlighted by Hess, that incorporation and transformation are also key aspects of incumbent strategy. So in both cases, the core incumbents such as Philips or Shell were at the same time also investing in startups that were basically trying to profit from the development of this new niche, right? So this is a quite, I think, standard strategic approach by incumbents, right? So they try to postpone the transition or the development of the new technology cycle as long as they can, so they can profit from their previous investments, but they also want to make sure that they are not missing out when the next technology cycle can actually be postponed anymore. The second topic, which has been more scarcely considered in the transitions literature, is the ability of incumbents to innovate and drive transitions. So one very relevant paper in this regard is this one here by Ulrich Dewald and Nachtem Bosch on innovation in the cement industry. So the paper is not exclusively looking at incumbents, but rather the whole innovation system around new cement technologies. However, to a large extent, incumbents do make up the innovation system in this industry. So what they do is that they hypothesize a number of challenges that they sort of expect that this innovation system is facing in developing new, novel cement technologies. And basically, they more or less confirm all those challenges for the cement industry. So it's an industry characterized by incremental innovation, little internal R&D capacity, and find it difficult to implement new knowledge, consisting of a small number of global producers where economies of scale are essential. They find it difficult to attract human capital because very few people sort of grow up dreaming of working with cement in the future. It's also an invisible industry in the sense that it's geographically spread out, so it's never really of large regional importance. Right? So you have cement factories in all regions of the world because it's such a heavy goods that you cannot really transport it over long distances once it's ready. And it also needs to be stirred, etc. So therefore, you have cement factories, right, in all regions, which means that it never is a truly regional priority because it never really has any sort of significant scale. It also consists of small groups of firms which are self-organizing, and where we have little competition, in particular when we are talking about non-price-based competition, right? So it's a price-sensitive industry, but it's not very focused on different qualities, etc. And niche markets are very small, and even niche markets are concerned. Okay, so to summarize, generally speaking, the knowledge that we have on incumbents in transitions is primarily concerned with the incentives of incumbents to engage in transition processes, and particularly how incumbents resist transitions. So this is sort of the full circle you'll see on the slide here. But one of the points that I like about this Van Mossel paper is that they don't always only focus on how incumbents delay the transition or remain inert, but they also recognize that incumbents may be first movers, which is what you see in sort of the non-full circle on your left-hand side. However, empirically, we know very little on when and how incumbents are actually able to innovate and drive transitions. So this is what I'll focus on in the rest of my time. So now we'll turn a bit to the organizational studies literature to better understand what actually conditions the ability of incumbents to innovate. So in a seminal paper from 2000, Chandy and Tallis, they coined the term the incumbents curse. Right? And the incumbents curse is sort of a hypothesis that they present, which is that incumbents might be unwilling to invest in radical innovations for multiple reasons. Firstly, they simply have lower incentives because profit streams, they come from current technologies. They also give lower priority to knowledge that's unrelated to their current focus areas because their current strengths follow from specialization in certain competence fields. And the profitability that they enjoy is a result of the ability to solve challenges related to their existing products and processes. Thirdly, they mention organizational routines, which are built around existing production systems. They create efficiency in producing and innovating on these existing product designs, but also leads to the risk of myopia. So basically make it very difficult for these incumbents to engage in distance search. So these points all sort of point to this tension between exploration and exploitation. And these are all reasons that incumbents have a high propensity to focus on the latter of the two. Finally, they also talk about negative size effects. It simply is difficult for inventors to capture the benefits of new inventions if they are working in a big incumbent firm relative to if they are managing their own firm. And then they also talk about bureaucratic inertia, right? So it might be that there are many good ideas that are being developed in these large firms, but you need to run it up the management chain, and there are many different steps along the way where these good ideas can be killed. Maybe because they're not so good, but maybe also for other reasons, for internal political reasons or many other aspects. At the same time, Chandy and Tallis also talk about benefits to incumbency. Right? So despite all these disadvantages, there might also be benefits to incumbency. They talk about customer knowledge. So the incumbents have a high ability to evaluate the potential of radical innovations. They talk about customer franchise, pointing out that radical innovations are risky also for customers, but they might be perceived as less risky if they are being sold by an established firm that the customers know. They talk about market power, which is basically preferential access to distribution channels. And then similarly, there might also be positive size effects, in the sense of access to capital and access to technical capabilities. So I try to sort of make a summary of this very big literature, but to try to sort of make it quite simple. Right? And if I look at this literature, I see that then sort of the question of when do incumbents, when are they more likely to innovate, right? Because we have those reasons for why they should not be, but also why they should be able to innovate in radical innovations. So it actually, in that sense, is an open question. When are they actually innovating or not, right? And if I look at this literature, I see that there's these 4 different points that are being made. One is that they are more likely to introduce radical innovations if they establish designated new divisions. Second one is if they develop upstream component knowledge. Third one, if they develop knowledge about new markets. And the fourth one is if they add new competences to the management team. So I'll briefly go through those 4 points in the next slide. So why would creating new divisions make incumbents more innovative? Oops, sorry. Well, as we discussed previously, then incumbent firms must overcome these internal forces of inertia and resistance to change, which are based on the routine systems that produce predictability and reliability. Furthermore, radical organizational transformations are fundamentally political processes. So mechanisms to overcome resistance to change are the creation of legitimacy within the firm for autonomous action. So what is needed is essentially organizational procedures which are specifically designed to support and encourage search for new products and services. We might call this sort of an institutionalized product and service innovation strategy. So here the importance of these loosely coupled standalone divisions to develop and commercialize new technologies is central. One further thing to notice is that, of course, business units themselves do not help if the business unit managers do not have enough autonomy. So in many cases, we see that business units are being established, but the business unit managers simply don't have any autonomy to decide what happens inside of them. So in that sense, they are actually not truly managing these business units. We have two options here. We can talk about thematic divisions for new product fields, but we can also talk about one division that's responsible for developing all types of new products and services. The second point is about developing upstream component knowledge. This highlights that investments in basic and not just applied research facilitate innovativeness. This points to this need for moving beyond limited search in relation to existing products and production techniques, and highlights the role of organizational slack, which you might understand as the cushion of actual or potential resources, which allows an organization to adapt successfully to external pressures for change. So basically the point here is that incumbents with access to upstream component knowledge are more innovative. So in a very nice paper by Roy and Sakar in SMJ a few years ago, they highlight that incumbents in the robotics industry that have internal available upstream knowledge are more innovative in new product markets. And what is really important from a transition perspective is that they also abandon old product markets faster. So the authors here talk about the new toy behavioral effect of firms, which basically highlights how you get faster rid of the old if you have better opportunities for jumping into the new. So this highlights that once incumbent managers decide to change the product portfolio, then changes may happen actually quite fast. So of course, this is in some way encouraging when we think about the role of incumbents in transition processes. The third point is then about developing knowledge about new markets. So this highlights that lack of market knowledge for novel products is a central barrier. So basically incumbent firms that strategically try to gain knowledge about new markets are also better able to quickly introduce radical innovations. So in that sense, it's similar to internal upstream component knowledge, that internal downstream market knowledge also facilitates innovation. Sort of in a traditional management style 2x2 matrix, then Roy and Sakar sort of say that those that are actually really able to introduce radical new innovations, when we talk about incumbents, are of course those that both have upstream component knowledge and internal downstream market knowledge. And then finally, surprise, surprise, the role of managers is also considered important in the management literature. So one paper I would highlight here that sort of gives a nice account on this is this paper by Rosenblum from 2000, which is a single case longitudinal study of NCR, which is producing cash registers, basically highlighting how this firm has managed to retain leadership throughout multiple technology cycles, right? And the point that Rosenblum makes here is that leadership changes have been crucial in allowing this firm to sort of keep its position throughout multiple technology cycles. The suggestion is also that changes in management often precedes decisions by incumbents to establish new divisions, invest in upstream component knowledge, and to develop knowledge about new markets. So in that sense, this factor might be linked to the other ones. Okay, so in the following, I'll try to present an example of how this perspective can help us to understand transition processes. And I'll do that drawing on work that we've been doing in Lund over the last 5 to 10 years on the transition to of the pulp and paper industry in the Nordic countries towards biorefining. What is biorefining and biorefineries? Well, there are many different definitions of what that actually entails out there. This table here provides you with a selection of those definitions. But a sort of generally used definition is this one here, that biorefineries are an overall concept of a processing plant where biomass feedstocks are converted and extracted into a spectrum of valuable products. You can think about it as similar in many ways to an oil refinery, right? So in an oil refinery, you have raw oil coming in the door, and then you have fuels, you have chemicals, you have plastics leaving in the other end. This is a similar type of facility here, just that the input is not raw oil, but organic material. And then you can use that to produce bioplastics, biofuels, biomaterials, biochemicals, etc., etc. Now, if you look at all kinds of different policy documents that focus on the transition to a bioeconomy, then you'll see that they all highlight the importance of biorefineries, right? Irrespectively of whether you talk about the EU, the IEA, the World Economic Forum, or the multiple different national bioeconomy strategies which you find out there. Also, when we talk about policy attention, we see that there are lots of different policies out there that stimulate biorefineries, irrespectively of whether we talk about R&D support, support for demonstration plants, whether we talk about clusters or innovation networks, etc. Significant amount of policy support. And we also see that there is significant attention to biorefineries from academia. So this gives you the number of publications that are published on a yearly basis on the topic of biorefineries. And as you can see, that is sort of only going one way. Finally, biorefineries has also been highlighted as an opportunity for the pulp and paper industry, which at least some parts of this industry in a Northern European context face a number of different challenges. One is decreasing demand for paper. Second one is increasing competition from low-cost providers. And thirdly is attention to environmental impact. So in this situation here, biorefineries are seen as an opportunity by many to move away from solely low-value bulk production and to diversify into high-value products as well. For example, biochemicals or bioplastics. And then along the way, improve energy efficiency and reduce emissions. However, it is also very much an opportunity which has not fully materialized, okay? So we see that there are very few investments that are being made in biorefinery technologies by pulp and paper firms. We have one big retrofitting of a mill in the city of Örnsköldsvik in Sweden that happened quite some time ago. Then we have, for example, also a case here in Sunila in Finland, where there was a new component added to an existing plant. And then finally, we have perhaps the clearest example of a new biorefinery that's being developed or has been developed in recent years in the city of Äänekoski in Finland by Metsä Fibre, where this has been developed from scratch. This is by far the biggest investment, I think, in this industry has happened over the last few years. But overall, very few investments, right? So the question that we started out from was considering, why is that the case? Why so few investments when we have all these sort of more conducive mechanisms that should support development and commercialization of biorefineries? Why don't we see it happening here? So this is what we wanted to understand. What turned out was that organizational barriers was a very important part of the reason for this. Right? Firstly, lack of interest in new biorefining technologies, because these industries or these firms have competitive advantage in traditional products, and they continue to account for most of the profits that they gain. So they simply have greater incentive to prioritize investments in technologies that are related to paper or to packaging. But also that we found that they have limited abilities to mobilize the needed competences. So core competences in these firms relate to, again, paper, packaging, etc. And they find significant challenges in developing radical innovations. So to summarize, it's simply not easy to move from economies of scale and bulk production of commodities and price-based competition to economies of scope and a competitive strategy which is based on product differentiation and quality. Yeah? And this is very much highlighted in the quotes that you'll see on this page here. Yeah? Management simply doesn't understand what biorefinery is about, did one interviewer say. Right? They might have some idea, vague idea, it's something worth betting on in the future, but nothing more than that. So how then to overcome the barriers? Well, then we looked, of course, at those different aspects that we sort of found in this organizational studies literature. And we did find that designated biorefinery business units was seen as an important step towards further commercialization of these technologies. So as one of the informants said, you need to have designated divisions within the company. So the people from the traditional departments will not take decisions to invest in biorefining technologies. These processes step on their own feet. So what this informant is sort of indirectly talking about here is this fierce competition from investment funds that you'll find inside these big incumbents, right? So there's simply many different actors inside these firms who want money to invest in different projects, right? And very often, if you don't have these designated biorefinery business units, right, the financial funds are simply not being set aside for investments in biorefineries. However, importantly, it was not seen as being a sufficient step in itself. And partly this was because the size of these biorefinery investments are so big that at the end of the day, they do necessitate decision taking at the group management level, which is contrary to investments in improving existing technologies, which can often be taken at the divisional level. So we had several examples in interviews where sort of initially investments to or decisions to invest in R&D on biorefining was taken at a very low level. Decisions to invest in a pilot plant was taken at the divisional level. And then the final, the big decision to invest in commercializing these technologies in a full-scale plan had to be taken at the entire group management level. And they often stranded there, right? So we saw several cases where they moved all the way, and then at the end of the day, top management sort of turned the thumb down, and the whole thing blew up. Second point was about internal use of biorefinery products. So in some cases, full-scale investments have been made because the central firm needed the output for R&D purposes. For instance, lignin, which is a part of what you'll find in wood. This makes it easier to get investments accepted with the management because then there are no commercial requirements. So it sort of postponed the problem of securing a market for the products. However, these investments send important signals to customers. They say, yes, we are serious about lignin. We are investing in ensuring access to lignin. So collaborate with us in developing new lignin-based products. And then thirdly, also highlighted was the involvement of downstream actors. So commitments to purchasing agreements are extremely important because we're talking about products and moving into product markets that are radically different from those that these firms sell today. So it's highly uncertain to them whether there actually is a market or not. So because of that, partnerships with firms in industries such as chemicals, oil, automotive, textiles were crucial to investment decisions. It also means that it was highly problematic that many pulp and paper firms find it very difficult to initiate these cooperative relations with partners from downstream industries. And the point here is really that of reaching agreement around the business model. Right? They say that the interviewees we talked about from Pulp and Paper, it's very difficult to sort of agree on, who should be responsible for which steps in the process, and then of course also who should get which share of the profit. But those two things sort of are of course closely connected. So the pulp and paper firms are complaining that they're just being seen as suppliers of raw material, where they say that they should be be paid for all the knowledge they have of how to actually treat and do pre-treatment of the wood before you actually produce the final products. Yes, this is essentially saying the same thing here, right? Just highlighting that if biorefineries are to actually happen, well, we need the pulp and paper firms in there because they know a lot about the upstream technology. We probably also need the downstream players, for instance, from the petrochemical industries in there because they have a lot of market knowledge. But it simply often doesn't happen. Okay, so given time, I'll simply go to the conclusions here. Yeah. So the point that I wanted to make in this lecture here is that we have limited, even if increasing attention to the role of incumbents in the transitions literature. And to the extent that incumbents have been considered in the transitions literature, emphasis is very much on incumbent resistance towards transition processes. However, I've just sort of lifted a bit of the curtain behind all the rich insights that we can find in the strategic management literature on the role and opportunities of incumbents in periods of radical technological change. And my suggestion is that this is highly useful to understand the possibilities for turning these incumbents in scale-intensive industries into a progressive force for transition processes. And this is essentially very, very important if we are to deal with the challenges that we are facing, if we are to deal with the mess that we've gotten ourselves into, I would say. Okay, so with that, I'll thank you, and over to you, Lars.
Thanks, Thijs. Yes, let's give you a hand here because this was I think a really very nice presentation, very clear and very timely. It cannot sort of be emphasized enough how this is sort of a standing debate in the transitions literature about the role of incumbents. And I think what this lecture really did well is to sort of show the added value of making connections to other strands of literature, strategic management literature, but also how proper empirical research can help to re-theorize and to address these kind of debates and controversies in the literature. Great. So thanks a lot for that. We've got a bit of time now for questions. I see that Matthew and Christian and Renata and Michaela have questions here. So Matthew, you want to go first?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you, Thijs. That was super helpful and informative. Really appreciate it. So this is kind of I guess a big picture methodological question and also a clarification question that tries to connect some of the readings from today with the 2008 Markert and Trufer paper from yesterday. So when you were talking, let me see if I can find this note that I made. One of the early slides, you were talking about how it's important to include sort of a regime understanding when you're doing a TIS analysis, which includes incumbents, of course. And then I was thinking about this 2017 unpacking resource mobilization by incumbents for biorefineries, the one that you and Lars did in 2017, covering the biorefinery and the paper and pulp industry. And I was like flipping through that, And this, you guys are basically doing a sort of a variation of a TIS analysis there, right? But when I was looking at the Markert and Trufer paper, they have this very specific definition of what they think a TIS should be, and like for something to be, you know, when they're drawing boundaries, right, for the TIS, it has to. One of the specifications is that it restricts the system to actors, institutions, and networks that are supportive to the innovation process, right? So they want to exclude anything that's not supportive. And then I'm thinking about all of this organizational management literature, like that from the Navigators Through the Storm paper, which just provides all of these different sort of equally complex but different ways of understanding how organizational behavior actually plays out, right? And they all sort of have different ways of conceptualizing of agency in some sense within organizations. And I think that just sort of goes to show how complex organizational agency can be, and that it seems like a gross sort of oversimplification to say something like, well, a TIS is just comprised of the actors who are, who want to advance or further a technology or an innovation, I should say. And it seems like your study of incumbents, and in general, just all of this work on incumbents really kind of highlights that you can't sort of divide, you know, clearly cut into, and I think this is maybe relevant for what I want to work on. So I want to hear like your thoughts on this and what your experience has been. And so this is really a question for both of you, since this is your,
Sure. That's an excellent question, I think, and I think I will simply agree with you in terms of your evaluation of, you know, how to think about a technological innovation system. I also don't necessarily find the definition in the Markert and Trufer 2008 paper the most helpful for how to think about what actually constitutes